Assalamu alaikum and welcome to another show of the Muslim Geordie podcast. This is your host Abu Tayyib, and we have a lineup and a half tonight for you guys, and we're going to be talking about something really important. And I think it's going to be an enjoyable conversation because we've got some excellent guests lined up for tonight's program. Before that, let's very quickly let me do my intro of the sponsors. Big up Zaf at HM Residential, Hill Matheson. Big up Omar, Manjaro's Newcastle. As always, we love your support. It helps us with our programming and so on and so forth. So, of course, we want to give a shout out to you guys first before we start this program. So, let's get to the topic. I think this is going to be an interesting one. There's going to be a lot of discussions, a lot of opinions, a lot of back and forth, I think, on this one. Tonight, we're going to be talking about Islam, fitness, and combat sports. And so I'm just going to start off. Before I introduce the guests, I'm just going to start off with a couple of things, right? Just to set the scene a little bit. And I think this is important. The Prophet ﷺ said in an authentic narration, your body has rights over you. And this is going to set the scene for the topic of discussion for tonight. And he also mentions in another narration that the strong believer is better and more beloved to Allah than the weak believer, although both are good. So, there's a number of things that we know from our tradition and our history that the Prophet ﷺ, peace be upon him, he praised good health and even regarded it as more important than money. And from an Islamic perspective, and we're gonna touch upon this a bit more throughout the show as well, I'm sure. We hear many of our scholars talking about and reminding us that fitness of the body is an important aspect, and we had a lengthy discussion about this in last night's podcast about the importance of health, well-being, fitness, not just of the body but of the mind and also spiritually as well. And I think this is important because we have from the Islamic viewpoint, we have to find that balance between the physical, mental, and spiritual health, which is highlighted in numerous places in our tradition. So I'm going to, introduce our guests with that as a backdrop. And this is what we're going to be focusing on today's conversation, with a specific focus on combat sports. Because in the house, we've got, a boxer, an MMA fighter. Hopefully we're going to have somebody who's going to come on who's going to represent bare knuckle boxing as well, a wrestler. We've got it all in tonight's program, right? So, and we're going to look at some of the different disciplines in a bit more depth, also, inshallah. So, let me start with my co-host Ilyas Karmani. Sheikh Ilyas, how you doing, bro? You're on mute, bro. You're on mute.
Assalamu alaikum to everyone. Alhamdulillah, very well. 21st night. May Allah Ta'ala send His blessings upon all of us, inshallah. Ameen. And it's wonderful to be in the company of you, illustrious brothers, mashallah.
Excellent, right. So, bro, let's start off with, let me ask you a question, yeah?
Yeah.
Before I start introducing everybody else, let me ask you a question. So, with this in mind, what we're talking about from Islam, fitness, and combat sports, and I guess it's a continuation from our discussion last night that we were having about health and well-being. What does Islam say about, fitness and combat sports? What is the details around that? Functional training, fighting, and all of that sort of stuff.
Yeah. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, salatu wassalam ala rasulillah. Look, actually, there is such a vast body of, you could say, Islamic scholarship in this particular area, and it sets so much parameters to maintain, obviously, the limit of the harm, the benefit to avoid the harm. Now, you mentioned two hadiths at the beginning. The strong believer is better than the weak believer. And we discussed this yesterday as well. And the importance of physical fitness within Islam, which is actually protecting the amana of your body. This gift, the trust of good health has to be maintained. And it's actually haram, impermissible for a Muslim to deliberately harm their own body. So we discussed this all yesterday. But in the context of tonight's discussion, there's a third hadith, which I think is very, very important. And it's the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. He said, the strong one is not the wrestler who can wrestle the other person, but is the one who controls their anger and their emotions at a time of indignation. So this is really one of the big kind of conditions, you could say, of any kind of combat art, that if you can control the emotional process and you do not control your emotions from overspilling into ego, into pride, into hate, into conflict, into harming others, then you have kept the balance right. And that's one of the amazing things I know with coaches like Imran, and I'm sure like, with other coaches, as well, with Pete as well, that good coaches actually inculcate discipline and control and emotional control. And are more than just coaches in terms of the physical, they're holistic coaches. They're coaching you mind, body, and soul. And that creates the real discipline. So, alhamdulillah, in terms of training, I have no, from the Islamic point of view, the training is so important under a legitimate coach who is developing all of those holistic qualities. The problems occur, as I said, with coming into the competition realm, in particular the professional competition realm. I think the amateur realm is a bit more, you could say, controlled with really strong ethical principles. So I'm going to go through a bit of a checklist of what I think are the important issues. First, what is your intention for doing this? If you're doing this genuinely to develop yourself as a human being, and I know boxing, for example, the boxing sessions that we've run through youth work have been so important in getting kids off the street, in giving them direction, in giving them discipline, in giving them purpose, in attaching them to really good coaches who help them throughout their lives and almost become like father figures, and provide a real kind of home for them. So get the intention right. You're doing it for the sake of Allah. You're doing it for your own personal betterment. You're not doing it, as I said, for ego, for pride, for all of the other things. Now, the really contentious area is the striking of the face. The hadith on this is very, very clear. It's a hadith in Bukhari and Muslim that the Prophet ﷺ forbade the striking of the face of your brother and also the face of any other human being. The hadith is very, very clear that Allah Ta'ala created Adam in his image. And so therefore, he prohibited the striking of the face. Hadith is authentic. And I think this also exemplifies a very, very beautiful value within Islam, which is that, this face that we've been given, this physical body that we've been given, do not harm the physical body. Do not inflict pain and suffering on the physical body of a human being. So this now really limits the type of combat art and the context of the combat art. And wrestling and certain arts, I think, and I believe in what I call pure arts. That's why I don't really like MMA for that reason, And that's my own personal opinion, because I think it obviously doesn't maintain the purity of an art. So grappling, wrestling, various things which don't involve striking of the face. And if we really consider that, look, we have the medical evidence now quite clearly around brain damage. I think in the last 30 years, 350 boxers have died in the ring. This is a serious amount of loss that's in the ring. And anyone who knows the game will know that, when the conditioning isn't there, in the environment of professional boxing, when millions are at stake, when careers are at stake, and especially for poor kids coming from poor backgrounds, this is one of the only ways for social mobility, that, there's such a pressure on those kids. And the industry is profoundly corrupt. I don't think any one of us would disagree with that and what is involved in the industry. So brain damage, Parkinson's disease, as we know, the greatest athlete of all time, Muhammad Ali, iconic, brought the name Muhammad into every village in the world, every home into the world, and gave us pride. He himself.
Yes, you went straight into the controversy. I was going to build up to that, but that's all right.
Anyway,
we'll go straight into it.
Let me mention a few more points and then then there's the issue of harm. Physical harm of the body. There's the issue of the company and environment, especially in the professional world, and some of the trappings. If you look at, I don't even like to mention that person's name, who is the most successful athlete in the world, boxer in the world, who is a wife beater, was convicted of domestic violence, yet we glorify this particular individual. Uncovering of the aura, the nationalism, the negative competition, all of these factors. There's a lot that has to be taken into account. But Islam again has a tradition for 1400 years of warrior arts, absolutely. And this was done in the legitimate armies. Muslim armies for 1400 years had codes of conduct, had codes of militarism, had codes of training, which are amazing codes, subhanAllah. And so, but when you look at these codes, they're done within disciplined, regimented frameworks where the individuals had that real balance between mind, body, and soul. Really important. That's the way of the warrior, is the balance between mind, body, and soul. When you have a warrior, when you have an individual who has the physical attributes, but not the spiritual and the mental, believe me, Believe me, this is an individual who uses lethal weapons to harm vulnerable people, not to protect.
Well, there's a lot to unpack there, right? So
Yeah.
let me try and sort of bring everybody in and let them defend their positions as well. And let me bring Abdurrahman in first, because there's a couple of things that I know we're going to get some back and forth on. But let me bring Abdurrahman in first to talk a little bit about the last few points that you made, which are around the history of martial arts and the link to Islam. Simply because Abdurrahman is, in my view, a historian, a specialist on the subject. And I want his views on this first, and then we'll talk about the controversial stuff and the other things that you mentioned also. So, Abdurrahman, let me ask you the question, bro. You know, in terms of the history of the combat, sort of the warrior combat code and the links to Islam, maybe you could talk a little bit about this to start off with, and then we'll talk about some of the other stuff that Ilyas has mentioned by bringing the other guests into this conversation.
Okay, so everyone can hear me, yeah? So first of all, thanks for having me on. Very interesting topic, and by all means, anyone can feel free to interject. But I'm going to speak about this, as you've kind of indicated, purely from an objective historical point of view, less so on the theology, because that requires a lot of in-depth discussion and contextualization of various hadith, etc. But let's give an overview. First of all, combat sports didn't develop as sports. They developed as combat skills, which were necessary for the defense of home and country. So as long as you had warfare, as long as you had armies, they felt the need, of course, to develop certain skills, especially if they lost their weaponry. Hence, you have the term karate, which means empty hand. If you lose your sword, your spear, your bow and arrow, are you still able to put a beat down on the opponent? In that sense, combat sports, which is what you would do in terms of your training your soldiers in and out of a theater of war, are as ancient as human civilization itself. So if we look at these three sports concurrently, which is mixed martial arts, boxing and wrestling. So of the three, wrestling is something which is known as a universal culture, meaning there isn't a society we know of except it had some other form of wrestling. Why? Because it doesn't require any accessorization. In fact, the ancient Greeks used to have so little accessories that they actually used to wrestle naked, as they used to do with many other sports. Boxing, the earliest record we know is about 3 millennia BC, the Sumerian civilization, which is now Iraq. It spread to Egypt about 2,000 years later. So we're still talking, 3,000 years ago, give or take. As for MMA, mixed martial arts, it was one of the first combat sports alongside boxing, alongside wrestling in the original Olympics. So we're talking 8th century BC, and that lasted for 1,000 years, boxing, wrestling, and MMA, except they didn't call it MMA, they called it pancration. Why did it stop when it stopped? It stopped in the AD 394 because the Roman Empire had become a Christian empire. And the origin of the Olympic Games was a celebration of, or to honor the pagan gods, to honor Zeus. So now you had Theodosius, he becomes a Christian, makes the Roman Empire Christian, and he wants to do away with any semblance, any vestiges of paganism. So that's when he closed or he shut down the Olympic Games. But bear in mind, MMA, or as it was known then, pancration, was just as historic and has and as what was the word Ilyas used? As original, or whatever the word he used, as boxing, as wrestling, in terms of a sport. That's the first thing to bear in mind. Secondly, just to stay on the MMA point, MMA is the most functional of all the combat sports because it's not a purely a sport, because in the sense that if you're having, going back to the military example, if you're having a war, wars don't have rules. In a war, you do what you like to, you have to do what you have to do in order to defeat the enemy. Likewise, and this kind of brings in the issue of punching to the face. If we say, because that hadith in context is about altercation, if you have an altercation with someone, you shouldn't strike him in the face because he's your brother. In a war, you're not going to have a gentlemanly rule like, look, don't hit me in the face. You can shoot me in the face. You can slice my head off, just don't punch me in the face. Of course, that's not how it works. So in that sense, in order to be prepared for war, you would have as much as live drilling as is required. And that's, in that sense, there's a bit of a gray zone between understanding the prohibition of hitting in the face in terms of a purely sporting thing, as opposed to an altercation, like when you're having a problem with a fellow believer, or any son of man, or daughter of Adam for that matter. Then of course you should not try to disfigure them. But that's different from combat training, in which case a person needs to be calloused, or it would help certainly if they're calloused as much as they can be in whatever way one wants to understand that. Okay, so these three sports then, Olympic sports, died in the 4th century. Then they had a revival, uniquely spurred by the UK, by Britain, in the late 18th century. So what you had in the late 19th century, you had the development of something called catch wrestling in Lancashire. So these were basically grappling matches, but with submission, what we call submission grappling. Equivalent to what you would see in a jiu-jitsu tournament or a Abu Dhabi combat tournament. So basically you're allowed to take someone down and then put joint locks on them, pressure points, chokes, and things like that. That developed in England, in, as I said, Lancashire, in the late 19th century. From there, it went on to America, and it became very popular as a kind of circus act, and it strayed away from its origin. But it stayed true to itself in the UK. One man in particular called Billy Riley, if I remember his name rightly, he founded what's called the Snake Pit, where he wanted to keep the martial or the combat element of it. And then he trained Billy Robinson, who then went to Japan. And this is where we now come full circle. So he went to Japan in the 20th century, and he trained very famous European professional wrestlers such as Karl Gotch, Louis Thez. Maybe people haven't heard of their names, but they certainly would have heard of their students, such as Ric Flair. I'm sure many people have heard his name. Or if anyone is aware of the name Ken Shamrock, or from the UFC, Eric Paulson, what's the guy's name? Josh Barnett. So these people, their lineage is actually an English lineage. Even though they're Americans and they're trained in Japan, they learned this catch wrestling, which is hybrid wrestling. And when the Japanese decided that they want to make this into an entertainment sport, or for viewing purposes, they called it pankras, in honor of pankration, the name of the original Olympic sport of mixed martial arts. So it had an element of striking, but not so much punching to the face, but everything else was there. And that was incorporated in the year 1993, the very same year, incidentally, that the UFC became incorporated in America. And the UFC itself has a British lineage, in the sense you had this family, the Gracies from Scotland, emigrated in the early 20th century to Brazil. They hooked up with some judo instructors, and then they developed Brazilian jiu-jitsu, and that made its way to America. So the UFC, entirely independently, was inaugurated the very same year that Pankras was inaugurated in Japan. Both of them had an English heritage, and they both harken back to that original ancient Olympic sport of pankration, which is mixed martial arts, which is the truest martial art. And I'm not saying this from any point of bias. I'm saying this purely from point of view of function. In functionality, in warfare, you don't have the benefit of dictating how your opponent will attack you, and it is essentially a no-holds-barred combat sport.
Yeah, Jazakallah khair. Thank you for that, Abdurrahman. And I think that it does shed a bit more light, and we've had these discussions offline many times as well about some of the controversial points that usually get brought up. Let me bring in Pete and Imran now, because there's a number of points that have been made by both yourself and Ilyas, which affects directly the work that they do. So Imran, let me just introduce these two guys. Imran Naeem is a long-term IDC supporter, of course, boxing coach and local legend, of course, right? As is Pete, a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt and leading MMA coach. Again, another local legend up here in the Northeast. I'm going to bring you both guys into this conversation because a couple of points that I picked up on straight away was, number one, which directly affects both of you, which is about the striking in the face and the positions behind, the intentions behind professional fighting and so on and so forth. But there's one question that I do have, with regards to another point that was made, which was about MMA, mixed martial arts. Now, Ilyas said something along the lines of, the lack of purity of it, I guess, or the disciplinarian purity. And I do disagree slightly with that. I agree and I disagree. A lot of young people, they think they follow mixed martial arts in the sense of they learn a bit of striking, they learn a bit of wrestling, learn a bit of this, that, and the other, and then they think they're an MMA fighter. But actually, and do correct me if I'm wrong, Pete, to be an MMA fighter, you have to be grounded in a particular skill and discipline first, and then you move on to another discipline and become grounded in that. And that's how you become a well-rounded MMA fighter, by being well-grounded and disciplined in each particular one. If you want to comment on that, just maybe chime in on that.
Traditionally, that was the way that people came from a background of a specific martial art. Do we have the echo?
Okay, let me mute myself.
Yeah, traditionally, people came from a specific martial art, and the original form, that was a pretty comprehensive overview of the evolution of mixed martial arts there. What happened in Brazil that led to the formation of the UFC was inter-style challenges, where jiu-jitsu would challenge karate to establish who was the best and so on. And for a long time, Brazilian jiu-jitsu came to prominence there. However, what happened as people mixed, it became apparent that in fact the mixture was necessary for absolute success. And so you will still get people who come from a predominantly wrestling background or jiu-jitsu background or boxing background, etc. But it's very, very mixed now. It's very much about the quality of the individual.
And how does that fare with some of the things, the history behind mixed martial arts and as you mentioned, the evolution of MMA? How does that fare now with, in terms of, do you believe it's a better way to have that flexibility and that mixture, or do you still sort of advocate the having one solid discipline and then building on that and then becoming more of a rounded fighter in that sense?
It's very difficult actually to be elite these days. You really need to have people starting as a youngster. They need those skills to be imported from very early on and cultivate those athletic abilities and the capacity to compete from a very young age. I prefer people to have a good understanding of each individual art, not simply how they combine. That can come afterwards, and that's the method that I would prefer to espouse, to have a good comprehension of the absolute system of the science of boxing, the science of wrestling, and put those things together.
Okay, brilliant. I'm going to bring Imran in. Imran, that with regards to you being a boxing coach, what's your view on everything that's been said so far? Because there's one thing that I noticed. You always use the term the sweet science, yeah, and I want you to explain that as well when you're talking about your particular discipline and why you got involved in that, in boxing in particular, and how you reconcile your Islam with boxing from what Sheikh Ilyas was talking about just earlier on as well.
Okay, Assalamu alaikum everyone. Thank you all for tuning in. It's lovely to see everyone, mashallah, this blessed month. I call boxing the sweet science, as you know. A lot of people call it the sweet science. It's known as the sweet science, and the reason for that is it's probably the purest form of martial arts you can get. Very limited on obviously using only your hands, and because of that reason, footwork is involved, head movement is involved, contortion of the body, hands to defend yourself. So there's a lot of facets. It's like the physical form. It's like the physical form of chess, if you like. You need to outthink your opponent, outmaneuver your opponent, and set traps, and find the weaknesses of what your opponent may have, and try and exploit those. I've listened and understood everything. It's a difficult. I know it's very, very difficult. I know Islamically you know, that, you know, hitting of the face and what have you. I totally understand that, and I get that. My take on it is I wouldn't for 1 second try to justify what I'm doing as Islamic, or try and justify what I'm doing. All I can say is I understand it, and I know the benefits of it. And in the context of the sport is where I keep it. Yes, there's you know, people who excel. They can make money from it. And brother Ilyas is absolutely correct and right to say that there's a lot of things that are wrong with boxing, but we have so many amazing examples of what's right with it, with you know, the likes of Baterbiev from Russia, who's a Muslim world champion, many Muslim world champions. The best I can think of is actually a martial artist who is obviously our brother, Mr. Nurmagomedov, who is a fantastic Muslim and a great ambassador. And that's what we should be trying to do, is getting positive role models for our young people to be able to follow.
Yeah, Jazakallah khair. I'm going to read some comments out, right? And from this point, I just want everybody to jump in as and when they feel like, right? They can, you don't have to wait for me to introduce you and stuff. I just did that for the introduction so that everybody knows who everybody is, right? So we've got a comment here from Gabriel Adam, which says, if helmets are worn, is strike in the face still not allowed? Maybe Ilyas, you could jump in first, and then.
Look, do you know, one of the things I think I've maintained, and it was really wonderful to hear from Abdurrahman, and a wonderful history of combat arts, and you're right, relating it back to the core discipline of what this was ultimately about, which is protection in a, you know, when you are actually in warfare, where, as we know, it's contextualized. Absolutely. See, I am not against combat arts and martial arts. I've done it. All my black kids are black belts in kickboxing. I believe in doing it through what I call, you know, legitimate frameworks, where there's a discipline, there's a structure, you know, and absolutely amateur boxing. I absolutely have no problem with amateur boxing. I think amateur boxing is an amazing discipline. And you're right, head guards are very, very protective. And it's not about knocking out the opponent. As Imran says, it's a game of chess to become victorious without hurting your opponent. I know his words exactly, okay? And so the point here is this, I totally agree with that. And I said what Pete is saying as well, working with a disciplined coach who's taking you systematically, and you have the real respect for your coach as well, who takes you through disciplines and builds up that whole portfolio of skills and disciplines that you have. Actually, again, I have no problem with the training and with the sparring and with all of that that's done in there. I think that, if anything, that's something which is a very good discipline when it's done with the right intention. So there's no issue with that whatsoever, I think, you know, and I think we're all got to be quite clear on that. You know, I think there is also an interesting issue which comes into what we call masculinity as well. There is an issue around masculinity, yes, and I think it's very important. Men will be men. We have testosterone. And it's important to recognize that and to channel that into something constructive. And you know, but one of the things I want people to realize is this. Yeah, this is where I don't like the machismo of it, and I don't like the negative competition which overflows into ego and nationalism and all kinds of things. Yeah, these are lethal weapons. People have to realize that. These can kill people. It's not a game always. I've seen people training. I've been in gyms for 35 years. I've seen people training where they have no concept of how to control the ego, and they use their fists to harm vulnerable people rather than to protect those who are vulnerable. Well, that's interesting. I want to make a final really controversial point now.
Yeah, before that, bro, just want to comment on that point that you've made there. Now, I've been to both Natural Progression and I've been to the Fight Center where Pete's at, right?
Yeah.
And I have to say, I've always been an admirer and really, you know, respected them both as coaches. The level of discipline that they teach, the etiquettes, the ethics that go with the training that they give, is exactly, you know, it basically touches upon the point that you were making. Maybe Pete, you can talk about, you know, let's get you talking a little bit about, you know, the Fight Center in Shieldfield, right? Your center that you have, and you know, what did you actually teach there apart from, you know, fighting skills and the elements that come with that? And why did you get involved in martial arts in the first place? Maybe you can share some of that story, because I know this is linked to what we're talking about here.
Yeah, well, actually, I think we're going to end up answering the same question. I got into fighting as a young man because I was driven. Well, I'm not bound by religious prohibition, but I still have the very same conflicts. I'm very conflicted about violence in general, and about bringing young men and women into combat sports. I worry about them. I truly fear for them, and I discourage a lot of people from competing in sports where striking the face is part of the sport. So one of the things that we teach is Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and also wrestling, and so people can compete at that relatively safely. I mean, it's injurious to the joints perhaps, but to the mind it doesn't have any negative effects. Mixed martial arts and boxing and Muay Thai are certainly dangerous to the health of the mind. And it worries me more. It never worried me for myself as a young man. I didn't have the foresight, and now I'm suffering the after effects. And when young men come through behind me, and I'm supposed to guide them, it's a nerve-wracking position to be in. And it's a constant case of weighing the benefits against the potential negatives. I'm still at this point confident that those benefits are there. The things that people gain from being able to compete and being able to make a living at these sports outweighs the risks. I really think that, you know, in some sense, I believe we all feel that we're put on this earth to give and receive love, but also there's a part of our nature, especially as men and young men, where you're driven to compete, and there's some urge to do harm to your fellow man in some way for some reason. And the benefit of these sports is that you can reconcile those two parts of your nature in a way that's honorable. That's the point of having those rule sets and having that arena, however corrupt the professional angle may be. It's the best solution that I've been able to find for myself and for the young men in my area.
Yeah, brilliant. Imran.
Yeah, it's a very important point, and I absolutely agree with Pete, who's put it out so eloquently, brilliantly well. A lot of the young people who come to my gym are there because of low self-esteem and confidence. They have issues around their confidence. They're being bullied and what have you. My 100% belief is I'm not there to teach your child to fight back as such. I'm there to build their confidence. All of our young people need to be valued members within the community that they represent and live in. And we see it so often. We've taken just examples. I know every single boxing gym, every single MMA gym, kickboxing gym, any sporting arena will tell you exactly the same thing. Is that we take young people, boys and girls, off the streets, and the whole reason of Natural Progression Boxing Academy starting was because there were so many young people on the streets of Stockton, hanging around street corners, nothing to do, getting into trouble, antisocial behaviour. All of these issues came to the fore, and it was that reason alone that we opened the gym. And slowly, we got together. We started training them. We started coaching them, and the number one thing for me is when we go to a boxing show, and I get feedback that, Imran, your boxers are so polite and they're so respectful pleases, thank yous, and all that type of thing. That really resonates with me, and that means more to me, or equally as much as winning national titles, winning European titles, whatever it might be. Having young people who have learned a martial arts and don't take advantage of other people. Yes, it happens. Yeah, and it's quickly addressed. I'm not going to sit here and say in the 22 years of me having the gym, I haven't had an issue where a young person has gone from defending themselves to then becoming an aggressor and a known advocate of violence. Yeah, but it's quickly quashed. Yeah, either they straighten up or they're taken out of the gym. We won't allow anyone to walk in there and try and control anyone in there. It's a very safe place for young people to come and train. That's why parents are. I'm getting messages constantly through the day. We have sessions for young people. We have sessions for ladies only. We have sessions for adults who want to lose weight. We have sessions for people who want to compete and want to test themselves against other people. And we have professional fighters who just happen to be very, very good at what the sport that they've chosen, and they want to take it further. And I feel I'm very blessed in that situation.
Yeah, Jazakallah khair. Ilyas, Abdurrahman, jump in anytime you guys want with when we're talking about some of this stuff. But I'm just looking at the comments, guys. Yeah, there's some back and forth going with some of the viewers about which is the best discipline. Some people are saying Muay Thai is the strongest. Others are saying wrestling is the strongest. What is going on here? What are your thoughts on this? This back and forth that's going on. Which one is the better discipline here?
What I would say is that every sport has its arena. Every sport has its arena. Every sport has its strengths and weaknesses. I'm not going to come here and sit here and say, listen, Pete Irving, yeah, boxing is number one. I can't sit here and say that.
Do you know, Imran, this is part of the problem, you see. It's like his beer. It's like his beer, yeah? My one's better than your one, and your one's better than my one. And this is where then you get the negative competition, yeah?
Yeah.
And this is where people lose their code of honor, I think. And this is where people get a bit bigoted and this is where pride takes over. And this is where the negative comes in. I think what Pete said is so important. Two fighters go into a ring, both have respect for each other, both are there to actually not want to harm each other, both want to go home to their families. Okay, we're testing our mettle. Okay, and we're also paying tribute to our coaches and everything else and our discipline. And if I lose, I lost to the better person, and I have honor and respect, and I learned the lesson from that. There's nothing purer than that. And that's why when we get into this who's better than who, and then hybridizing and mixing it and losing, and people cheating and misleading, it really becomes, I think, a bit of a problem. Yeah.
I think with regards to some of the positive elements that Imran and both Peter were talking about, there's a comment here by Sheikh Fahad. He says, I think for common folks, an easy form of martial arts they can develop with highest return on investment is mental awareness. And I think this is something important. I've heard Eddie from the Dean Show talk about this. I've heard many coaches talk about, not only the physical discipline, but the mental impact, positive mental impact that it has of training of any form of martial arts. Maybe you guys want to talk a little bit about that and just expand a bit on that, because I think that's important to highlight also.
Can I take this one?
Go for it.
Yeah, I don't think it really matters what the vehicle is. These discussions are never going to end. This martial art's better than this one. And a lot of it comes down to the individual. It doesn't really matter what the vehicle is that it's supposed to be, unless we're talking about high earners where it's their actual occupation and they're making a real livelihood out of that. For most young men, they're not going to get to that point. It's just a means for teaching life lessons. And I think I failed to understand this myself. I was so obsessed with the artistry and the science of what I was doing that it became an obsession. And I didn't actually manage to apply any of those lessons in my own life. It's only now that I'm being able to unpick those lessons. But that's what martial arts and boxing are supposed to inculcate, is those aspects of discipline, to use those conflicts as a means to comprehend the broader challenges of life, and to maintain your pride and your determination, and pride as in pride in oneself and accomplishments, etc.
You know what's interesting is that, if you watch the Rocky films, yeah, and really, who is Rocky fighting in every single film? Who is he fighting? He's fighting himself in every single film, and he's fighting an attribute of human behavior in every film. So they're quite brilliant in that regard. Although I've got to say, Rocky 5 was pretty rubbish. Yeah, okay. Tommy, that was Tommy Gunn.
That's my favorite Rocky, bro.
Oh, get away, Tommy Gunn. No, purist. It's got to be Rocky Bell. It's got to be Buster Lang.
Number 3.
Three. Anyway, the point I'm saying is just what the Prophet said. It's jihad against your nafs. You're fighting against yourself. And if you don't have control of yourself, believe me, you'll never have control of, any other attribute that you have. You have to fight your own ego. It's your battle all your life is against your own ego. And Ramadan is actually a battle against our own ego, against our own pride, against our own self-infatuation and self-absorption, yeah? Humility, and that's what Rocky learns all the way through, is humility more than anything else, yeah? And respect and basic principles, yeah? Sorry, Imran.
What I was going to say was, nowadays, you look at boxers, you get exceptional athletes who were not given the platform because of the respect that they show the sport, their opponents. Then you get average and mediocre combatants who were given the platform because they can use this, and they have the medium of social media, which allows them to live every second of every day of their life, be extroverts to the extreme, and have a fan base physically and through social media, and that is what's attracting the new generation of combat sport fans. Unfortunately, that's the world we're living in. I don't agree with it. I think I think fighters should be given their opportunities on their merit and not on their social media following. Unfortunately, that's coming to the fore
that's
now.
what Abdurrahman was talking about earlier, from the origins of martial arts and then now becoming entertainment. That's what it is, essentially. It's entertainment, right? Abdurrahman, maybe you might want to comment something on that, about how it's become like entertainment rather than what it was originally founded for.
Yeah, we could. Yeah, maybe we could tie in these things together with an anecdote from someone from the Northeast, Ian the Machine Freeman from Sunderland, who was had a very successful career in mixed martial arts. So he started off as a bodybuilder, and he did boxing, as most lads do, I guess. And he mentions in his biography how he had an altercation once with someone in an alley, and this guy was much bigger than him. Ian Freeman himself is a bit of a brick proverbial house, but even then he said this person was much bigger than him, and he said he hit him, and Ian Freeman is notorious for having a very solid punch, and he said the guy fell and then he got back up, and he said no matter what I did, he kept on getting back up. Why? Because he was under the influence of some or other kind of narcotics. He was on coke or crack or whatever it was. So he wasn't cognizant of the fact that he might have broke his jaw, or his nose might be busted up. All he saw is that he has someone in front of him and he has to keep dealing with him. At that point, Ian Freeman said he realized that he needed to add an element of functionality to stop that problem from happening. That's why I went into grappling. So I would advise it in that sense. It doesn't really matter which sport. I think Pete was kind of mentioned this, which sport a person excels in, so long as you actually have quote unquote mat time or sparring time, where a person knows what it feels like to get attacked, to get pushed up against the cage or the ropes, to get a few digs in the body, whatever it might be. That itself will then reflect a person's persona when they're in their gait, in their confidence, and it's a well-known cliche that the person who often is looking for a fight is a bully who lacks that confidence, and the one who knows how to fight doesn't go looking for a fight because he has that confidence, he or she, I should say. And so no matter what the sport is, boxing, wrestling, jiu-jitsu, mixing it all up, so long as a person has that real spar time, mat time, ring time, and I don't mean at the professional level. I think as a Muslims, we agree that the professional sport is something we can't condone. But I mean, purely in terms of what's been said already, in terms of training, then you will be able to carry that confidence, that self-awareness, not just awareness of oneself, but awareness of everyone around you as well. As is often said, when you go to some countries where they have very lax driving laws, they say you don't just have to drive on account of yourself. You have to drive for everyone else as well. You have to take into account how crazy everyone around you might be driving, and that's how you will avoid an accident. Likewise, if a person is dabbled in some or other form of martial arts or mix them up together, as long as they have them within themselves a functional awareness of their own limits, as they say, man's got to know his limitations, to quote Dirty Harry, then they will be able to read an aggressor and walk away from it. And that is, of course, the best thing to do, as Sheikh Ilyas mentioned earlier, is to be able to control one's ego and to control one's anger. The winner of the fight is not the one who is able to take lots of hits and gets up. I'm talking about a real fight. It's the one who doesn't get hit at all. If you're able to walk away, swallow your pride, walk away, avoid jail time, avoid hurting that person who still is a human being. You might have had a bad day. You know, that's true. That's a true warrior code, in that you know when to pick your fights, and ideally, if you can avoid a fight at all, that's the greatest victory there is.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's a brilliant point, and that's what I would say is that's why the element of competition for young people is essential, because it steers them away from that altercation outside of the sport. If we as coaches train these young people, they want to test themselves, and we've got to provide that platform in a safe and healthy environment for them, allow them to do that. And England boxing do a phenomenal job of the up and down the country. The northeast is absolutely thriving with quality fighters. You're going to see a number of boxers going to the Olympics, God willing, inshallah. From the northeast, we've got exceptional fighters who are already world champions, male and female, or future world champions, or on the verge of becoming world champions, who are brilliant role models for these young people. And we've got to allow these young people to express themselves in a safe environment, as I've said, and steer them away from the possible altercations that they might have when they're with their friends, or when they come up against someone who's had a little bit too much to drink, or something like that, and they know right from wrong and what to do. My advice is, you've got legs, use them. I know plenty of people, who were brilliant young people, and who unfortunately have been forced. Their hand has been forced. They've used, as Brother Ilyas has said, they're lethal weapons, and unfortunately they've got involved in something, and and they feel bad about it. They've injured the other person, or they've been injured themselves, and it's taken them out of something that they love for such a prolonged period of time, and we don't want that. Myself, Peter, and any other coach worth their salt is there to provide a safe platform for people to express themselves.
Yeah. There's a comment here by Maj Khan. If anything, I believe ego and discipline is a reflection of the coach. I've had the pleasure of training with Pete, and I entered the gym cocky and arrogant, thinking I will know how to fight as a young man. But even after a few sessions, Pete put across to me and a few other brothers how important it is to be humble and respectful in MMA, and I can vouch for that as well. And there's a comment that Jordan just put on there as well, and it's something that I learned very, very early on, that when you know who you are and you know how to fight, you've got nothing to prove to anybody. It's usually the ones who have something to prove, who don't know what they're doing, have something to prove. That's from my experience, what I found, especially with some of the youth. I don't know if you guys agree with me on that.
Yeah, there's a verse in the Quran, وَإِبَادِ الرَّحْمَنِ الَّذِينَ يَمْشُونَ عَلَى الْأَرْضِ حَوْنًا وَإِذَا خَاطِبَهُمُ الْجَاهِلُونَ قَالُوا سَلَامًا, which is basically what you just said there, that the worshippers of the merciful walk upon the earth with a tranquility. And that's what Jordan's saying there. You know your worth. You don't have to prove it to anyone. And so when people agitate or provoke you, you don't go to the gutter. They go low, you go high. That's the whole point here. I want to put a really controversial comment out.
Go on then.
I really want to kind of get.
We know you're not going to hang back, Elias. Go for it.
Do you know when the Khabib and Conor fight took place? Yeah.
Yeah.
I did the khutbah that week, and I said, you guys have all been mugged off by this multi-million-pound industry that has mugged you off to buy your pay-per-view with this idea that Khabib and Conor was Islamophobic and all this kind of nonsense. Yeah. It was basically Rocky IV that they fell for, okay? And I said, look, the point of the matter is, look, I know Khabib has been mentioned here. I have to really say this industry is profoundly indecent and corrupt and immoral and morally bankrupt, as far as I'm concerned. The sexism, I think there's a racism in the whole thing as well. Just the way, and there's, as Imran mentioned, there's deep politics in it. It's not a meritocracy at all. This is all about cashing in billions on a global level. UFC has obviously taken over the whole landscape of kind of professional fighting out there, and so really, what are we doing being mugged off, paying £50 pay-per-view, staying up 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, being mugged off by Khabib versus Conor? Okay, so that was the point I'm making here as well. We bring I respect any fighter from any background regardless of whether they're Muslim or non-Muslim, just based on their integrity and their values and their code. That's what but I think, again, the negative aspect of it is that we will back a fighter because they're Muslim, regardless of how immoral they are. Okay, and I think this is where we get mugged off, I think, by the whole industry. So I don't know what people think about that.
I think with regards to Khabib, it's slightly different. Like, because you mentioned earlier on, look, we've had in our history, we've had many famous, Muslim combat personalities. Muhammad Ali, who really inspired generations across all backgrounds, Muslim and non-Muslim. Mike Tyson, okay, Prince Naseem, Amir Khan. You've got these in recent times. You've got many Olympic champions across the Muslim lands in various disciplines of combat sports, which I'm sure Abdurrahman is waiting to chime in on this one, especially from the Central Asia region, around wrestling and other disciplines. And of course, in recent times with Khabib, I think it's something slightly different, because he is at the same time an ambassador of Islam, and he does represent Islam in a very positive way by using his fame, his skills, his combat, and so on and so forth, in order to put across a different message that you would get from maybe other Muslim personalities out there. So I think with Khabib, it's slightly different in my view. Maybe Abdurrahman, you want to jump in on this, because
what I would say is don't look at what Khabib is saying. Don't look at what he's doing. Look at what other people are saying about him. Everyone says he doesn't lie. He didn't say that. Everyone says he's truthful. Everyone says that he's a brilliant guy. Everyone says that he helps other people. Everyone says that he gives charity. He didn't attribute any of those to himself. He doesn't stand there and say, I'm a Muslim, I'm doing this, I'm doing that. It's other people who are saying it. And that is the difference between other Muslims in mainstream combat sport and most likely him. That's how I feel. Also, if you look at him, his mannerisms, the way he speaks, the way, obviously, the press conference of with Conor McGregor, Look at his mannerisms. Look at the way he behaved. And I'm going to be honest. If that was me in his situation, tables would have probably turned, because there's building a fight, yeah, and then there's going to the extreme where you're abusing family, and more than even family, you're abusing our beautiful religion of Islam.
And of course, he has
It's
phenomenal
very, very
skills.
difficult. But the fact that he kept
Yeah.
his calm, kept his cool, it said a lot about him as a person. So that's maybe
As
what I
well
would-
as well as his elite skills in combat in the combat sport.
Oh yeah, he's very good as well.
Well, I can't really offer any insight about Khabib as a Muslim, but what I do see is that he's an incredibly significant figure in a time of great tension between the US and the Russian states. They have a Russian on the posters who's being adored by the fans, and they're desperate for him to come back in a time where the US has an extraordinarily strained relationship with Islam in general. You've got a Muslim man saying, "I won't fight because it's Ramadan." Everyone says, "Great, good for you." It's like it's really significant. And so, as with all major sports figures, in political figures or anybody, in fact, you have the person themselves as a living human being, and then you have the icon and what they represent. And so the icon of Khabib is maybe more important because that is the one that we know. Everything else is speculation, or we can only really guess about him as a person unless we know him. But as an icon, we can really say that he's been positive. And maybe I appreciate that it's a little bit naive to say, oh well, this is broken down barriers because someone is a fan of Khabib. Now they have some sort of greater. I don't want to use the word tolerance because that sounds like are we aiming for tolerance? Is that the limit? But some sort of understanding, some sort of bridge to understanding the communities that are by our side. This is what's been marvelous for me as a involvement in mixed martial arts. We talked about British wrestling culture in the catch wrestling of the previous centuries, but British wrestling culture essentially died, and wrestling culture was reinvigorated because of mixed martial arts, and it was reinvigorated really by immigrants from Iran, from Dagestan, from Afghanistan. The biggest influences in some of the biggest influences in my training have been Abdul Muhammad from Afghanistan, who was a great champion. He's from settled in Middlesbrough.
Hassan Muradi.
Yeah, Hassan. Wow, Hassan was an incredible wrestler, absolutely powerhouse. My coach over here, Kieran. Every time I meet somebody from Iran, whether it's driving a taxi or in a takeaway or wherever, I meet some Iranian guys. The subject comes up about wrestling because of my ears, and I say, oh yeah, I was trained by K1, and it would be like what you said from average Joe in Newcastle would be like saying, oh, I played football with Alan Shearer. They absolutely adore him, they worship him, and that guy was like, he was inspirational. All the young guys who came around and we wrestled with the Iranian guys, and they were all incredible. But Kirwan was like, we used to train in Elzikpool, and there was a matted room in Elzikpool, and it was where all the heating ducts were from the pool, and so this was during Ramadan, and so we knew Kirwan hadn't eaten or drank all day, and dark's already gone. He's still training hard, and he was outstripping absolutely everybody in this room because the heating ducts were in there. It was like a sauna, and he was absolutely phenomenal. We were dropping down, couldn't keep pace with him, and he hadn't even drank all day. It was absolutely incredible, and that admiration for him and what he was going through there, that did form this sort of bridge, this admiration for his dedication. So perhaps again, I'm not claiming that this is like, it's a little bit naive to say, oh, now you know somebody and you know somebody's story as if racism is gonna end because we make a friend, But in some sense, it was really an important bridge for a lot of people that we got this figure that we admire. And so for me personally, of course, it was Abdul Muhammad and K1, But then in a broader sense, now Khabib represents that in a way that makes it accessible for just the average fan.
No,
And of course,
Yeah,
you've trained with a lot of Dagestani fighters as well. So share some of those experiences, because I know Abdurrahman's gonna talk about, and he's talked about the history behind it as well. He's put some videos out there as well on his channel, which I highly recommend everybody watch. Knowledge North, by the way, go to the YouTube channel. Amazing stuff on there. But is it, with regards to the fighters, Khabib, in terms of their skills, we're talking about, the fighters from that particular, the region that you've even trained with. Why is it that they've got something special about them? I mean, you talked about wrestling, the English wrestling dying off. I mean, gone are the days of Big Daddy and Giant Haystacks, right? So we're talking about,
that is one of the reasons why English wrestling died, and American wrestling also died down the same track. We had the history brief before that the Lancashire Catch went to America and became carnival wrestling, which morphed into the WWE. And so a little bit of trivia: you had what you called shoots and works. So a shoot was a real wrestling match, and a work was a predetermined outcome. And so what they would do is, because the crowds were so big, they didn't have big screens in those days, etc., and the matches were going on too long, they weren't entertaining for the crowds. So backstage, they would have a shoot, and then the winner of the actual match would then choreograph the show so that he would win. And so it was so the world champion was genuinely the world champion, but the show that the people saw was exaggerated for effect, and then that morphed into WWE, which is just essentially a soap opera now. So I'm sorry, I lost track of where I was going with this. What was my original?
No, I was talking because you've trained with Dagestani fighters, and I was going to ask Abdurrahman, why is Khabib so dominant in the sport? Why is he? Is this nature? Is it nurture? Apart from him fighting bears as a kid and stuff, right? But what's the reason why that sort of cohort of people are so solid in and dominant when it comes to mixed martial arts?
Well, there's a short. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, go for it,
go ahead.
man. Go for it.
Okay, well, there's a short answer, the long answer. So, maybe you go for an intermediate one. But first, just to reiterate what Pete was saying, that this issue of the bridge, it's not actually a theory. It's something that has been empirically affirmed, and I'm not just talking about other fighters mentioning how his integrity, his religiosity, his honoring his father, honoring his nation, honoring his name, and his religious discipline. Not just other fighters, but people who definitely would not normally cross that kind of bridge, because it's easy for a fellow MMA enthusiast to praise someone they look up to, they admire, because he's in their field. But even had, excuse me for bringing such an example up, we even had adult porn actresses saying how famous ones, I won't name them to give them that airtime, but mentioning how they broke down in tears when they saw him, Khabib, break down in tears, and the effect that had on them, and then they started reminiscing about their relationship with their parents, and so many other things we could mention. But in terms of him and the region he represents, sport is war by other means. It's not as simple as someone who is, let's say, using some talent in order to advance himself in a material capacity. There is a tradition of and again, we can go into a great length, but try not to. But there's a tradition in that region specifically where they have to, how can you say, justify their existence, carve out their space as equals. Khabib is the first crossover Muslim athlete in Russia. They've had champions galore. I mean, if you go back to names that enthusiasts of MMA will be aware of, or the Olympics. For example, Matt Lindland, who was part of Team Quest, the same as Randy Couture and Dan Henderson's team, he lost in the Olympics to Murad Kardanov, who was from that region. He was a Circassian from Russia. Murad Kardanov was not necessarily religious. He's from that cohort, a Muslim from the North Caucasus. He was involved in breweries and things like that. Anyway, he beat Matt Lindland. This was as the Soviet Union collapsed, people started to rediscover their identity, their religiosity, and you saw that this reflected in the people who were competing in sports, because especially combat sports, because in that region, which we can get into why they have a particularly hyper skill set in terms of combat sports. So you saw this progression. So, for example, the person who beat Daniel Cormier, I'm sure many people are familiar with, former two-time UFC champion and still a commentator. He lost in the Olympics to a guy called Haj Murad Gastalov, who is a Ossetian, and this guy is deeply religious. So you had one guy beat an American who was, had a brewery, and then the next guy in the next Olympics, whether it be Sydney or I can't remember which one exactly, then suddenly you have someone who's quite religious, and then you have Jordan Burroughs, who's regarded by many to be the greatest American wrestler in the last, let's say, 10, 20 years. He's only been beaten twice, both by deeply religious Muslims from the North Caucasus, one guy called Murad Kardanov, who is a Circassian, and by Anwar Gedoyev, and the other guy, Denis Sarkov, who is a Abkhazian. So why is it, so Khabib is part of this, he's part, bear in mind, all of these names I mentioned, they never made it to page one of any Russian equivalent of Hello Magazine. They weren't considered people that needed to be pushed out. It's almost like America at the civil rights time. That's what Russia's been experiencing in the last 10 years. I'm talking about the 60s, when where you had the black glove that would be raised by Afro-American athletes, as a protest, or Muhammad Ali's throwing his gold medal into the Hudson or whichever river it was, Mississippi perhaps, I can't remember. But that phase has been happening now in Russia in the last 10 years, and Khabib is the first one who's made that crossover. And many of the people generally from that region who do succeed in Olympic sports, they tend to go on to politics anyway. And you can actually see now, even among some of these republics, when I say republics, it's more like a equivalent of a US state. So it's still part of the country of the United States, but it has, a semi-autonomous status. So many of the presidents or parliamentarians of these republics are former Olympic champions, including a Slavic Christian one, nominally Christian, what's his name? Alexander Karelin, he's in the Russian Duma. So Khabib is on track in about 15 years' time to become the first Muslim president of Russia, frankly. If you look at Imran Khan's trajectory, using his sporting celebrity, and I'm not justifying anything, by the way, I'm just making out that this is how analysts and the talking heads are speaking about this in terms of the social phenomenon, and that he's made just to give an example, Putin, for example, who's the current president of Russia, he was very much supporting a Christian, a muscular Christian perception of what it means to be Russian, and that's why you'd see, for example, he would attach himself to Fyodor Emelianenko's successors, who would wear a cross when he would fight in his combat arena. You saw something quite phenomenal happen after the Conor fight, in that when Khabib went to see with his late father Putin, Putin for the first time acknowledged, and he used the words, "We are one family." He's putting now these two Muslims on an equal footing with him as a devout Christian. And then in the second meeting following the Justin Poirier fight, it was even more of a meeting of equals, not so much a master-servant relationship, which was certainly the case in the Caucasus prior to, let's say, 20, 30 years, where the people survived genocides. In fact, entire nations were wiped out when the Russians took over this. So, and just to end on this particular point, one important example would be the Saitiev brothers, Bovesar Saitiev, who is regarded generally as the greatest living wrestler alive today. He's multiple Olympic and world champion. He's a Chechen, and he mentioned that he was raised in the Chechen War, where you had basically a quarter of the male population thinned out. I mean, that's quite a staggering statistic. 1 in 4 men disappeared, let alone what happened to women and children in orphanage and dispossession and so on and so forth. So he was born in that. And Khabib's father reflected on these kind of situations, said, when you have this kind of hostile environment, the youth will go into one of two directions. Either they will go into extremism, and we're talking about Islamic extremism on the level of Al-Qaeda and ISIS, and they'll hate the other. They'll hate the Christian. They'll hate the Russian Slav. We're North Caucasian. We're Chechen. We're Dagestani. We're Circassian. You scum have taken our land and raped our progeny, etc. Or you can redirect that energy towards something which is still within that macho culture that they have, but which is and it's still aggressive, but it's not harmful to anyone except those who've signed to the bout, who won't step in to that on that mat with you. And that's the direction these Saitiev brothers took during the Chechen Russian war, and they left their republic to excel in wrestling to the point that they actually became gold medalists. And then when they, like Khabib and like others, when they go back to their republics, they then are ambassadors for reviving their culture, their religiosity, to the extent, and I still remember, it's quite vivid, once, and this was going back 2 decades ago, when you had a Dagestani wrestler win the Olympics. He was interviewed by the Russian media, and they were very hostile because he had a short beard, just like, maybe it looked like Pete Speed. And they said to him, "What's this thing on your face? Why have you got this on your face?" Because they were putting him down simply because he was from Dagestan and he wasn't a Slav, but he won the gold. And he said, "Well, it's my religion. Am I not allowed to practice my religion?" That's how defensive he had to be. And if you look now, it's a complete reversal. Now, the entire Russian combat sports cohort who go to the Olympics, they're all practicing Muslim. They have actually their own Jamaat, their own congregational prayer, with the exception of one or two who are made to feel welcome regardless of their religiosity or their religion. So you see how the script is flipped. And that speaks to what some of the other panelists have been saying, that when you excel, when you become a champion, when you achieve things, and you become that role model, how do you use that? How do you use that platform? You can either use it to ingratiate yourself with finance and accolades and wealth and women, or you can say, look, I want to raise the standard of my people. I want to carve an equal space. I want to be treated as an equal to who are previously seen to be my colonizers. And that's what he has achieved. And that's not saying anything. We can go into that if that's the question that comes up. What makes him particularly, and those people, so deft at fighting, at combat sports, a separate question. But I just wanted to speak to this bridge that he's built, both internationally but also domestically. And if one understands anything about, and we all do, anecdotally, about how backward, repressive the Soviet and the communists were. We have the privilege of living in free societies. So he and others like him have managed to break down that barrier and carved out that level playing field for themselves due to their sporting prowess and due to their integrity and their crossover that they had, representing, whether people liked it or not, their own nation across the globe, across the world, in America and elsewhere.
As you're explaining, Abdurrahman, the images that come to my mind, it's very reminiscent of what Muhammad Ali did in the civil rights. When he got into those positions of champion and those positions wielding power and influence, and it sounds very, very similar to that. There's a lot of crossover there. Pete,
Exactly.
With regards to Dagestani fighters, the ones that you've trained with, what's your thoughts on that in terms of would you consider them a special breed and how they fight, and just picking up from what Abdurrahman was talking about as well?
In my experience, yeah, we get referrals from the West End Refugee Centre, and we had a young man called Shamil Gasanov just arrived at the gym one day, and it turned out he was the under-18s national wrestling champion, and he was an absolute phenom. And one day his weight wasn't coming down for one of his fights, and it turned out he hadn't been doing his road work. And one of the boys told me he just took off his wrestling boot, and his ankle is purple and covered in a bandage, and he'd broken his ankle, and hadn't wanted to tell me this in case I didn't allow him to compete. Thing like that was
Wow.
It was incredible, but it wasn't apparent during his training. He just poker faced the whole thing until he got into the changing rooms, and it turned out that he compressed it by putting it into the wrestling boot. It just incredibly mentally tough. I mean, that wasn't a wise thing to do. That's a young man's folly, but it did speak to how tough he was. And when he brought his brothers up from some guys who'd been living in Manchester and in Sheffield, they all came up with his coach, Magomed Shapirov, who lives in Manchester. He brought them all up. Again, this is another one of the stories during Ramadan where they all came up to spar and hadn't eaten or drank and had sat in this car all day and trounced everybody. They were absolutely phenomenal. And then went home without taking a sip of water. Unbelievable, and they got everybody's respect. But they really were. I mean, obviously, we're getting a selection of the toughest guys who made it here. Who had the determination to get all this way. but they were just, the whole crew were phenomenal, you know, and massively respectful too. The way that they talked to the sensei, they referred to him as sensei. You know, they would bow on and off the mats. They shook hands with everybody before and after training. You know, they were just real good young men. But yeah, the Dagestani people they're something special.
Yeah, unbelievable, amazing. You know, there's this. I'm just looking at the comments again. There's quite a few different discussions going on. Some are talking about MMA versus boxing, Pete versus Imran. They want to see that lineup happen, that matchup happen, right? There's questions.
I am messing with Peter. No.
Likewise,
There's-
actually, I
there's-
prefer boxing. You know, I prefer to I watch boxing for recreation. I only watch MMA for my professional education.
Okay, well, sure. There's questions about whoever wants to learn or a comment here. Whoever wants to learn about self-defense from Moon Turkey. Moon Turkey says, whoever wants to learn self-defense, try not to just go with jiu-jitsu because it's popular. Last thing you want to be is on the ground. I guess in a real life situation they're talking about. What's your thoughts on that as a jiu-jitsu coach, Pete?
Well, jiu-jitsu itself as a sport has diverged massively from its original intention. You know, as we got from a little history lesson, that the jiu-jitsu originated with the samurai, where it was, you know, it became the Olympic sport of judo, those throwing techniques, and the ground techniques were auxiliary to that. And then the trend in Brazil, for whatever reason, were towards the ground, and to the point where now sports jiu-jitsu is not the most effective base for MMA. That became wrestling, and now it appears to be striking, and so on as the trends go on. But jiu-jitsu athletes have been less and less effective going into that real fighting arena, and the sport of jiu-jitsu becomes less and less applicable to a self-defense situation. Still, the basics of jiu-jitsu are absolutely necessary for self-defense, because not from the sense that you want to take somebody to the ground and pull them on top of you, but if you find yourself there in many self-defense situations, you may already be decked before you even realize that you're in a fight. And if you can't navigate up and down, if you don't orientate yourself when you're on the ground, well, you probably won't be able to get yourself back to your feet in a position where you can run or you can effectively defend yourself. So I think jiu-jitsu is absolutely necessary for self-defense. All of the people I know who teach such as in specifically self-defense, non-sporting martial arts, also come and practice some sports jiu-jitsu. You know, they're not going to apply it the same. They're not going to use the tools in the same sense, you know, but it is important to have them. Still, but you know, this again, we're back to the previous topic. The punch or the kick or the joint lock or the throw or the escape. These are all tools. They're not things with that have a moral intention. You know, they're all that's all dependent on the user. So the way that they're used is about the intention of the user. Whether we're talking about the intention to defend oneself or the intention to do harm. You know, that comes to the user, and more back to the responsibility then of the coach to educate them about the correct time to use this technique and the correct intention to use it with.
Absolutely. I know we're coming towards the end of the show, guys, and I can't leave this conversation without bringing up the whole Jake Paul and your views on this whole YouTuber boxing stuff, right? Have they ruined boxing? Is this something which is taking a turn for the worse? What's going on with this, man? I mean, you got YouTubers calling out MMA fighters. You've got all sorts of stuff going on, right? What's the panel's views on this? Who wants to go first?
What I would say is it comes back to the generation that we're in. Social media is absolutely massive. Social media is many people's lives. They make. I'll fight Jake Paul every day of the week. But but what I was saying was, social media is a platform used to make money, and you know, these people have such a huge following of people who are majority of the people are not knowledgeable about martial arts. I would say that I'm saying that blindly and blanketly, but what I'm saying is they're following the person as opposed to the sport. And I think, well, it is what it is. You know, you get these people, they're going to make money. You make a choice whether you want to watch it or not. Personally, I didn't bother watching it. It's not something that I've got better things to do with my time. I've got a fantastic athlete there in Joe Maposa, who'll be fighting for the English title in July. If he got he's 10-0 as a boxer. This is his 11th fight. He's gone for an English title, and if he got just a smidgen, just a little bit of what Jake Paul's got, who has no background. My boy has a background in boxing. He's boxed in the GB squads. He's boxed with Nicola Adams and and Anthony Joshua and all of the Olympians. But if he got a little bit of of what Jake Paul has, he'd be absolutely massive. But the thing is that he carries himself with humility, and he's a lovely guy, and he's not going to get that. He's not going to get that. In terms of Jake Paul's skill set, he can box for sure. He can box definitely. He's shown skill sets, but money buys you the best coaches. Money buys you time, and he's used that. Obviously, boxing and other martial arts is about levels, and he's boxing at a certain level. He's boxing Ben Askren, who I mean, people know better, but I don't think the boy can't throw a straight shot. Never mind.
Ben Askren couldn't box eggs.
Yeah, there you go.
I want to see Jake Paul versus the Undertaker. That's the fight I want to see. Yeah, that's where it should be at. All right, what about this then? Yeah, I ask this question Imran all the time. Yeah, Ali versus Tyson.
Oh, bro, don't please. Why you start these?
Come on, man.
Why do you start this in Ramadan? Always like this, bro. Please, look. Tyson has said it himself. He's already said it that Ali, and he's not being polite or nice, but we're talking about mental warfare first, and he would have taken him to school. He would have sized him up, figured him out. He would have been steam coming from his ears, his nose, his eyes would have been bloodshot. He'd have been chasing shadows, and he'd have been schooled. So
what are you saying, Pete? Do you agree or disagree? What are you saying, bro?
Oh, are we talking about
Ali versus Tyson?
Ali versus Tyson. Oh, Ali. Yeah.
Elias, what are you saying, bro?
Well, look. If you look at Fraser, you look at Ken Norton. They were very Tyson-esque. So it's Ali, isn't it? Obviously, regardless of the facts, the heart will always say Muhammad Ali.
Abdurrahman, what are you saying, bro?
Well, I haven't got any right to comment due to my relative, unlike the experts. But I agree with Sheikh Ilyas said. The heart's going to go with Ali regardless.
All right,
it's a much better example.
All right, Imran, Floyd Mayweather, is he the greatest fighter? He reckons he is. What are you saying?
He's brilliant, no doubt about it. He's you've got to look at it in the context.
Bro, he reckons he's better than Muhammad Ali, man.
Yeah, of course, and he's got a right to say that because he's 50-0. But you've got to look at the context. You've got to look at let's take the Canelo fight for instance. Yeah, he boxed Canelo and he beat him and he looked outstanding. But you've got to look at the context. He drained Canelo until he was absolutely nothing left, and then got him in the ring. The same as I love Manny Pacquiao, but when he boxed Oscar De La Hoya, he drained him so much he was dead at the weight. And these fighters are fighting catch weight fights. Are not real. They're not fighting fighters at their true weights, and that really determines where they are. But he's the greatest of our generation, no doubt. But certainly not in the world for me. I mean, you've got Sugar Ray Robinson, you've got Homicide Hank, you've got Ali, you've got Willie Pep, you've got all of these Sandy Sadlers, all of these great fighters.
What about Tyson Fury versus Anthony Joshua?
Very good fight. very, very good fight,
Who
competitive
wins that
fight.
one,
But
in your opinion?
for me, Tyson Fury wins that. For me, Tyson Fury wins that. It's not going to be easy by any stretch. People are actually talking about Tyson Fury doing him in 2 or 3 rounds. That's not the case. I think AJ's got way too much pride, but I would side with Tyson Fury in that, and that is purely because of his footwork and his boxing ability.
Pete, what do you think? Tyson Fury or AJ? What are you calling for that one?
It's got to be Fury. Just that I'm still not sold on Joshua. I always had the feeling that he was the new Frank Bruno, and he looks fantastic, but spends too much time in the wrong gym. And yeah, I started to eat my words when he got back up against Klitschko. I thought he does have heart, and he does have science. I think he's perhaps underestimated for his craftiness, but in terms of skill, I think
I agree. I agree with Peter, because what happened initially in his very early career, you could see how big, how massive he was, and how now you look at him, he's tailored his training totally differently. Now he's doing a lot more boxing training as opposed to weights and other strength exercises. And you can see that what he's trying to do is lean up his muscle, build his oxygen capacity, so his muscles are not going to require as much oxygen as what they did before. However, you can see even in his latest fight, you can see after 2 or 3 rounds that he still needs to take a little bit of time out, and that's when Tyson Fury will probably capitalize, I would say.
Okay, last example. Khabib versus McGregor 2. What do you reckon, Pete?
Or if they were to fight
If they were to fight again, if it was to happen.
It's got to be Khabib all day long. I think Khabib's answered all the questions, and he's just gone off the boil. I mean, we're back to the whole Jake Paul business. It was him and Mayweather that opened the door for all of this to happen, and it was hard to resent McGregor's big paydays in the UFC, and hard to resent Mayweather's big paydays in boxing. For as much as we might not put him on a top 10, all time lists, he was a great strategist. All those things, getting the guy at the weight that he demanded, making himself the A side. He understood the business side. He's a great strategist outside of the ring as much as inside. So it was still hard to resent them commanding the biggest paydays, but that was what opened the door for this corruption of the sport, where it's purely the entertainment. The story that's sold to the casual fan became the be all and end all, and now we've got white collar boxers outstripping the earnings of real, genuine, crafty professionals, and it's painful. It's agony.
Well, I just want to take this opportunity to say that obviously there's a lot of hate for McGregor because of the Habib thing and all of that. I've had the pleasure of spending a full day with him, and it was in the month of Ramadan. We flew to Dublin, spent the whole day with him, and honestly, it's without a shadow of a doubt, it is a persona. It is a persona. He's not a nasty guy. He's not a racist. He's not an Islamophobe. We were given as much time with him as we wanted. He was ready to take us out for dinner. It was just happened to be that we were fasting. He was getting ready for I think it was the second Nate fight when we went, and he took 3 hours out of his day after he just trained, and I'm pretty sure that he was eating a small amount of food. I know how you just don't want to you don't want to spend time with anyone. You just want to concentrate on your training, and he was a lovely guy. So I just want to put it out there that
it's what Elias was saying earlier on, wasn't it? About that this is it's entertainment, isn't it? Essentially, that's what it comes down to. It's exactly what Elias was talking about earlier, the big fight and the build up and all the rest of it. And everyone bought into it. Right? Everyone literally bought into it. Yeah. So yeah, I think that's important clarification there. Jazakallah khair, Imran. We're going to wrap up the show now. Yeah. So I'm just going to give everyone the final word to say what they want to say. Elias, let's start with you, bro. And,
it's been really wonderful listening to both Pete and Imran. Really education for me as well. So I really appreciate that from both of you. Jazakallah khair. I think my view on professional combat sports and UFC in particular and boxing hasn't really changed much, of course, because I still think that this is a multi-billion-pound industry, which I think essentially does have a very corrupting influence. But what I will say overall regarding our conversation today is that there's a very thin line in this whole thing, a very thin line separating, you could say, the light from the dark, okay, the good from the bad, the harm from the benefit, that thin line. And that thin line actually goes through your human heart. It's your heart. And it's the intent. I started the whole discussion today with intention and really looking at your own heart. As the Prophet said, at-taqwa ha'una, consciousness of Allah is here in your heart. And I think if you keep your heart on the right side, then alhamdulillah, you get the benefit and you avoid the harm. I think it's very noble, it's honorable, it's a great discipline. And I as someone who's obviously been involved in lots of sport for the last 35 years, I cannot but recommend it, for our young Muslims and across the whole of our community, because obviously fitness and maintaining the amount of our body is so important, inshallah.
Yeah, jazakallah khair. Imran, final comment from you.
I just want to say that it's always a pleasure to spend any amount of time with the brothers. Obviously, I haven't seen you guys for some time because of the virus, and this is a great opportunity. Thank you for allowing me to come on and speak about something that I love and that I'm so passionate about. I'd like to extend my friendship to Peter. I'd love to train with you, and I'd love to help you if I can, and vice versa if I can get something from you in terms of your knowledge and what have you, because I've really enjoyed listening to you and Brother Abdul Rahman. So I really appreciate the time that you've given. Thank you.
Pete, over to you, bro.
It's marvelous. Thank you very much. Same goes. I hope we can do that in future. I think Elias said it absolutely perfectly there. I don't have anything to add to that. I concur absolutely. But if you're interested in those positive things, if you're a listener from the Newcastle area, my gym's going to be open again very soon, hopefully on the 17th. And if anybody would like to try some Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, please come down to Newcastle Fight Centre.
Absolutely. And you've also got your DVDs, the Warrior Collective. I think that's people can watch those instructional videos as well.
Yes.
How can they get hold of that?
warriorcollective.co.uk, and you can purchase my instructional videos if you want to get some insight into some Khabib style wall takedowns.
Abdul Rahman, final word with you, bro.
Well, finally, I'd like to reiterate what everyone else has said. It's been an honor to share airtime with such a stellar cast. And finally, to the listeners, I would recommend anyone who hasn't trained in any semblance of martial arts, do try to train in at least one or more discipline to the extent that a person becomes confident. And that's all, because it's better to have those skills and not need them than to need them and not have them.
Absolutely. That sums it up beautifully. I'm not going to add anything else. I think that just sums it up perfectly. So thank you very much, everyone. Jazakumullah khair. Thank you for tuning in. We'll be back next Friday, I think. I don't know who we're going to be with. And we'll be back next weekend, Saturday and Sunday, with my co-host, Ustad Ilyas Karmani. We're going to be talking about, again, some very important topics around extremism, terrorism, sexual grooming. We're going to unpack all of those things that people don't really want to talk about. So we're going to be discussing that for next weekend's programs. On that note, guys, I'll see you all next weekend. Assalamu alaikum. Take care, everyone.